Welcome back. It's a terrific Tuesday here, class, as we get ready to read Chapter 6 in our story, The Quest for Clues. Amy feels like she might be onto something, so she's getting ready to find some more clues at the campground. Be sure to follow along and see if you can help her dissect this mystery of the missing fossil. So, here we go, Chapter 6, The Quest for Clues. When Amy arrived at the breakfast table the next morning, it was obvious that something was wrong. Tess and Dr. Forrester both looked tense, and no one at the breakfast table was talking. For once, even Felix was quiet. Amy slipped into the chair beside Matt and asked softly, "What's going on?" "Not sure," Matt whispered back. "They said they have something important to tell us, but wanted to wait until everyone was here." Julian was still missing. They all waited in silence until he finally came running up, flushed and breathless. "Sorry," he said, taking the last chair. "I overslept." Dr. Forrester clasped her hands on the table in front of her. "I'm afraid that Tess and I have some disturbing news. This morning when I went into the lab to see if the consolidant I applied to the gluey fossil last night was dry, I discovered they were gone." "Gone?" Amy exclaimed, her heart suddenly pounding. "All of them?" Felix asked wide-eyed. "Yes, every single one. We've looked everywhere, of course, but haven't found any trace of them. I can only conclude that someone took them during the night." She paused and looked hard at each person at the table, one by one. "Did any of you see or hear anything strange last night?" Amy shook her head and shot a glance at her fellow campers. They all seemed genuinely upset and denied seeing or hearing anything other than the rhythmic creaking sounds of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind. "Then I can only conclude," Dr. Forrester said with a heavy sigh, "we were the victims of a very clever fossil thieves." "People steal fossils?" Matt was incredulous. "Who'd want to make off with dinosaur bones?" "Oh, you'd be surprised," Dr. Forrester said grimly. "Fossil hunters supply museums and private collectors all over the world. Most are honest people who obey the laws about where and how they can collect fossils. But unfortunately, there are also some unscrupulous characters who dig up fossils on protected land without permission, or," she paused, "steal them from a paleontologist's dig site. Since none of us heard anything," Dr. Forrester continued, "I'm guessing the thieves parked their vehicle some distance from camp and then slipped in and out of camp on foot." "That SUV we saw yesterday," Felix mused. "That was pretty suspicious. Do you suppose the thieves were in that SUV? Maybe they were spying on us." Dr. Forrester shrugged. "It's possible, Felix, but it's just as likely that what we saw was nothing more than a car turning around." "What if the thieves come back?" Daria asked nervously. For the first time that morning, Dr. Forrester smiled. "That is the good news. I doubt very much that they will, because they took the only fossils we have here at camp right now. I can't imagine they'll return." "Shouldn't we call the police or something?" Matt asked. "Well, there aren't really police out here," Tess said. "At least not like there are in the city, but Dr. Forrester and I are discussing what to do." Tess served eggs and bacon, which put everyone in a better mood. But while the other campers chatted excitedly about fossil thieves and stolen bones, Amy was trying to think like Inspector Ellis. She guessed that the big thunderstorm had washed the little fossils into the gully, had also smoothed away any old tracks and footprints on the ground around camp. If fossil thieves had parked a vehicle nearby and walked into camp during the night, there should be clear sets of new tire tracks and boot prints to be found. She added this possibility, followed by a question mark, to the list in her notebook. Amy slipped out of camp while the others were busy making lunches and packing up the excavation gear. She circled the cluster of tents at a distance, scanning the ground in open areas and dry gullies wide enough for a vehicle to drive along. Wherever she looked, the sandy soil was rain-flattened and smooth, except for tiny footprints she guessed were made by ground squirrels and rabbits. There were no signs that anyone had approached their camp from the outside the night before. Finding no clues is a clue in itself, Amy thought. Convinced she'd made a thorough search, Amy headed back to camp. She was weaving around several clumps of tall grass when someone suddenly shouted, "Stop!" Amy froze as Julian appeared off to her left, hurrying toward her. "Don't take another step, Amy," he called out. "Stay absolutely still." She was about to ask why when she saw the snake emerge from a big clump of grass not 5 feet ahead and start slithering toward her. Amy's mouth went dry and cold sweat beaded her skin. Out of the corner of her eye, Amy saw Julian pick up a rock the size of a baseball. I'm going to toss this rock so it lands between you and the snake, he said worriedly. Hopefully the snake will go in the opposite direction and head away from you. Hopefully, Amy thought as her heart thumped louder. Are you ready? Amy wasn't sure she was, but she took a deep breath and said, ready, in a tight, squeaky voice. Julian chucked the rock and it landed exactly where he said it would. The snake stopped, tensed, and then turned and wriggled away, leaving a thin S-shaped track in the sand. Amy's breath went out of her in a huge rush as Julian came running up. That was too close, she said in a hoarse voice. If you hadn't stopped me right then. Anyway, thanks. You're welcome. He looked around and back at Amy. What are you doing way out here? I was looking for tire tracks and footprints, Amy admitted, to see if I could spot where the fossil thieves had parked their vehicles and where they'd walk into camp. Oh, Julian said, looking at her and then quickly glancing away. Did you find any? Amy said she hadn't, and then something occurred to her. So, Julian, what are you doing out here? It was getting time to leave, and I spotted you out here, so I thought I'd come and get you. The words tumbled out of his mouth in a sudden rush. Well, Amy said, watching him closely, it's a good thing you did. Where did you disappear to this morning? Matt asked later that day as he twirled his rock pick between his dusty hands. I was looking around the camp for evidence of fossil thieves, Amy murmured. What did you find? Not a single boot or tire print that can only mean one thing. Which is? Matt looked at Amy questioningly. She leaned closer and dropped her voice to a whisper. That the thief is one of us. Just then, Tess clapped her hands to get their attention. You're almost ready for the next stage of the excavation process, which is removing the bones you've exposed from the rock beneath them. This morning, Dr. Forrester and I are going to show you how that's done. They gathered around Dr. Forrester where she knelt by the leg bones she and Tess had been excavating. The challenge in removing fossil bones from the underlying rock is to make sure we collect them without breaking them. If we try to pry or chisel them out from underneath, we'd almost certainly break them. Instead, we use a clever technique called trenching. Take a look, she said, gesturing to the leg bone. After the entire bone was exposed on top, we started carefully chipping away the rock all around, about 6 inches out from the fossil. We chiseled down for several inches, well below where we think the underside of the leg bone is, and then started chiseling inward. As you can see here, what we've ended up with is our leg bone fossil sitting atop a narrow rock pillar. It looks like a mushroom, Crystal said. That's a very good description, Dr. Forrester said. Once we've had this mushroom shaped, we put what's called a plastic jacket around the mushroom cap. Tess continued, pulling on a pair of thin latex gloves. I'm going to demonstrate how paleontologists make a plastic jacket. It's a little like a doctor putting a plaster cast on someone's broken arm. I broke my arm and had a cast once, Daria said. Then you'll know what this leg bone is going to feel like, Tess joked. She had set out a bucket, a jug of water, a roll of paper towels, a wooden spoon, long strips of rough fabric, a bag labeled plaster of Paris. First, I'm going to cover the fossil with damp paper towels, Tess explained, laying several wet towels on the exposed bone. That will keep the plaster from sticking directly to our fossil. Next, I'll mix a white powdery compound called plaster of Paris with enough water to make a thin paste. Tess added water to the plaster in the bucket and used the wooden spoon to stir the two ingredients together. It looks like runny white frosting, said Felix, leaning over to peer into the bucket. Tess held up a strip of rough fabric. Now I'll soak strips of this burlap in the wet plaster and then lay them onto the fossil. She fitted and wrapped the mushroom cap with plaster soaked strips until the fossil was completely encased, except for the place on the underside where it was still connected to the little pillar of rock. Now we wait for the plaster to harden. But won't it take a long time for all the water to evaporate so it dries? Amy asked. Actually, the water isn't evaporating, Amy. Evaporation is a physical change in matter, a change in states. Here, the powdery plaster and the water I added to it are undergoing what's called a chemical change in matter. Remember that a physical change may alter some properties or the appearance of the substance, but it doesn't change what the substance is actually made of, its chemical composition. When matter undergoes a chemical change, however, its chemical composition does change. Typically, molecules of the starting substances break apart and the atoms rearrange themselves to form new molecules of different substances. After a chemical change takes place, you end up with new types of matter, often new compounds, with different properties than those you started with. In this case, the plaster dust and the water are combining in a chemical change to produce a new type of matter, solid, hardened plaster. Tess set the bucket of wet plaster in the middle of the group. Unlike physical changes in matter, many chemical changes are not reversible. In other words, they can't be undone. Another clue that a chemical change is taking place is that the energy is used up or given off in the process, often in the form of heat or light. With that in mind, I want you all to put your hands on the outside of this bucket and tell me what you feel. Everyone leaned in and did just that. It's warm, Crystal marveled. When a mixture of plaster of Paris and water undergo a chemical change, heat is given off, Tess explained. Enough heat to make the plaster quite toasty as it hardens. She stood and peeled off her latex gloves. Tess suggested they all eat lunch while the plaster jacket finished hardening. When they returned, Dr. Forrester knocked on the jacket with her knuckles. Good and solid. Now, Tess and I will break the cap off the mushroom, so to speak, and plaster over the hole in the bottom, just like we did at the top. While Tess gripped the jacket firmly, Dr. Forrester used a hammer and chisel to break it free from the rock pillars. They flipped the jacket over and then applied more strips of plaster-soaked burlap to the bottom. When they were finished, the fossil was completely enclosed and looked like a huge white egg. When it's dry, Tess explained, we'll use permanent marker to write a fossil number, the date, and the location of the dig site on the jacket. Then we'll take it back to camp. Actually, I'd like us to stop working a little early today, Dr. Forrester said. Tess and I have been talking about our missing fossils, and I've decided to go drive over to Dry Creek and tell the sheriff what happened. It's a long drive, so I'll stay overnight. I'll ask the sheriff to come back with me tomorrow morning and take a look around. Wow, a sheriff, Felix exclaimed. Just like the Old West. Those fossil thieves better watch out. Tess asked Julian and Amy to help her carry the jacketed fossil bone down to where the two pickups were parked. As they set it gently into the back of one, Amy realized that Julian had hardly said a word since the snake incident that morning. When Tess headed back up to the dig site, he just stood by the pickup and kicked one of the tires. Thanks again for saving me from the snake, she said. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shouted at me. Julian was silent for a long moment and then asked, what do you think the sheriff will do to the fossil thieves if he catches them? Amy shrugged. I suppose he'll arrest them. Julian didn't say anything. That Julian character sure is looking a bit suspicious if you ask me. I guess we'll find out tomorrow what happens. Don't forget to go on to Google Classroom and do your assignment for Chapter 6. Tomorrow when you come back, we'll be working on Chapter 7. The clues add up. I hope y'all have a terrific Tuesday, and I will see you back here tomorrow bright and early. Peace out, y'all.